This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1, and I am now joined here in the studio by Dr. Eitan Bar-Yosef, a literary scholar and cultural historian at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He is the editor of the prestigious journal Teoria Uvikoret, and author of the recently published A Villa in the Jungle, Africa in Israeli Culture. It just came out in Hebrew, but some excerpts are available in English as well. Hello, Eitan, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you.
So Africa and the Israeli culture, it's a pretty broad topic, but you chose to focus on the early years of the state, of the early decades, during which time Africa occupied the imagination of the Israelis quite a bit. I was amazed at how many examples are enumerated in your book. Why was that, do you think?
Right. Well, yes, the golden age of basically Israeli-African friendship was from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, when Golda Meir, who was then foreign minister, under the guidance of Ben Gurion, the prime minister, were very keen to actually try and move beyond Israel's immediate isolation. And Africa seemed like a wonderful place. This is just Africa just before decolonization in the early 1960s. So with the emergence of all these new states, Africa seemed like a wonderful place to try and make new friends. So Golda Meir sent envoys. As the new countries emerged in the early 60s, they also saw, the African leaders, in a relationship between Israel, which has just freed itself from British colonial rule, and the parallels between Israel and their own sort of histories. And the Israelis were very keen to basically try and stress this parallel, which is interesting because, of course, the rise of Israel in the late 1940s was not simply about freeing itself from colonial power, but also, as we know, a more complicated relationship with colonial tropes. Mm-hmm. But let me just add that the love story between Israel and Africa in the 1950s and onwards echoed a much earlier interest, and the book really starts not so much with the 1950s, but really also with Theodor Herzl, the visionary father of Zionism, mm-hmm. Whom in the 1890s began to think about Africa.
There was the famous plan to settle in Uganda in the, was it the early 20th century?
Yeah, this was 1903, the Uganda proposal. It's called the Uganda proposal, even though it was really sort of East Kenya.
Right.
And this never materialized, but I think the plan continued to haunt Zionism as an alternative sort of scenario, an alternative state. Now, why was it so significant for Herzl to try and think of the Uganda proposal as a solution to what he called the Jewish problem? This is because this was a political solution, but also
a practical one. It was offered a solution, and so he took it.
But there were also cultural resonances here, and people like Daniel Buyarin and Miki Gluzman have written about this. For centuries, the Jew was imagined in European culture as dark-skinned, even black. And Herzl, who very often sort of internalized these anti-Semitic sort of perceptions, also imagined Jews as being dark-skinned. And clearly, if you take the Jew and position him in Africa, then the skin becomes whiter.
It's actually quite striking because I think that, maybe more than that, Herzl saw himself as an Austrian gentleman.
Well, that's true. For him, the darker Jews really were the Ostjuden, the East European Jews. And this, of course, is before we bring into the picture the, let's say, North African Jews who would later immigrate to Israel. So, yes, there was a very complicated sort of cultural and racial economy here.
Yeah, but what you were talking about now from Golda Meir and the so-called peripheral alliance that Israel tried to make friends beyond the immediate surrounding, which were all enemy states. These are seem to me like realpolitik type of, but you're more interested in the cultural aspect of it. So how do they interact, the political and the cultural?
Right. You're absolutely right. Of course, there was a diplomatic calculation here, beyond doubt. That was the most immediate thing. But also, again, there was the cultural sort of meaning of all this. And this means that when the Israeli Jew goes to Africa to bring knowledge and technological assistance to the young African states, the Israeli Jew goes there as a white man. Okay, I have to say that biographically, this whole book started with the pictures of my own grandfather, Yosef Popishsky, who came to Israel, to Palestine, then from Lithuania in the 1930s. He was an engineer at the Mekorot, sort of waterworks. And he was sent, like many other Israeli experts, to Africa in the early 1960s. And we had his black and white photographs in the family album. You could see him standing there in an African Nigerian village, surrounded by the local peasants, and he shines there in his whiteness. Mm-hmm. Okay, now, so to bring knowledge, to bring civilization, to assist, is in many ways to be the white man in this relationship. And in many ways, so you're right, of course, it was the diplomatic, there were also economical, many different dimensions to this friendship. And it was a huge project that many Israelis have really preferred to forget. Thousands of Israelis went there to offer assistance, and thousands of Africans came to Israel in those years to study, to learn. Yeah. It was always very clear for the Israelis who's here to teach and who's here to learn, and that shaped the relationship.
So that brings me to my next question, which is, it's not just whiteness by default. They saw it as a tool to increase their whiteness, and being put in front of the Africans, it was a mechanism to redefine themselves as whites.
Absolutely. Again, very often, Ben Gurion wrote to Nkrumah, was the leader of Ghana. He said, that even we as white people suffered, meaning the Jews. Okay, so clearly there is. Very often you see how this whitening process works, this bleaching process. I don't want to underestimate, by the way, the significance of this project. I think that I don't see this necessarily as being sort of cynical. There was really an attempt to help these countries. Israelis really tried to bring their energy and their resources to help these young African states. And I don't want to sort of question that. But at the background were other cultural sort of issues that were working.
Yeah. So how, going back to the colonial / post-colonial matrix of things, where the Africans at that time aware of the complex relationship of Zionism to colonialism, or did they not ask any questions?
Well, many of these African countries belong to the sort of third world groups, and there very often Israel was criticized for being a tool of Western imperialism. This goes back to the Balfour Declaration and so forth. So I think they were aware of at least some dimensions of this, and very often, especially when we mentioned Ghana. So from the early 60s, Israelis were often shocked to see, on the one hand, the people of Ghana were very happy to accept Israeli assistance, but very often also condemned Israel in the UN, for example. There was this interesting sort of gap between the Israelis' messianic, idealistic expectations. What do we want, Israelis? That people would love us, the world would love us. It didn't always work because there was, as you say, realpolitik here. But clearly, after 1967, this became much more complicated. With the Israeli occupation of Sinai, Sinai was seen as part of Egypt, and Egypt, of course, was part of Africa. Yeah. And this seemed to sort of compromise territorially.
Is it also an ideological and political evolution of the African elites that led to this awareness, this growing awareness over time?
Yes, it was ideological. It was also, again, financial, with the growing involvement of the Arab states, the oil manufacturing states. More money came from there, so they naturally found themselves, growing more and more distant from Israel.
Mm-hmm. And Israel found itself drawing closer and closer to apartheid South Africa, for example.
Right, absolutely.
And the honeymoon was in the 70s.
Right. Again, in 73, after most of the African states severed their ties with Israel, Israel felt betrayed, turned to South Africa. Again, many parts of the story have been somehow forgotten. One of them, as I mentioned, was the fact that Israel was so heavily involved in Black Africa in the 1960s. Another part of the story is that so often we hear now the pairing of Israel and South Africa in the 70s that we actually forget that in the 1950s and 60s, Israel was quite a staunch critic of South Africa.
Yeah.
Golda Meir vowed never to visit there. And so in many ways, this really changed
But then
dramatically.
politics came in the way. One aspect of that, which is also explored in the part of the book that is translated in English, is the production in Tel Aviv of Cry the Beloved Country, the famous South African play that became, a cause célèbre for the liberal critics of apartheid South Africa. How did it come down in the Israeli cultural context?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting story. The original title of the musical was Lost in the Stars, an adaptation of Alan Paton's novel from 1948. And this was staged at Habima Theater in 1953. It was a huge production. It was staged more than 220 times, which is amazing considering the size of the population then. For many people in Israel, the production signaled the covenant between Jews and between the Black Africans. Again, and this is something that Herzl also spoke about, that like the Black Africans, Jews were also oppressed for centuries. In many ways, that's how the production was perceived when Ben Gurion and Moshe Dayan all came to see it. So this is Israel supporting the anti-apartheid cause. But there were other ways to understand this. It's interesting, as I point out in that discussion, that of course to play Africans on stage, Israeli actors used sort of heavy black makeup, what we call blackface. Yeah. And of course, I'm sure that your listeners know the tradition of blackface in the U.S., especially in the 19th century, and the role played by Jews in that tradition, for example, in The Jazz Singer, the first talkie from 1927. So all this adds a very complicated dimension.
This is something I didn't know, that Al Jolson was Jewish.
Well, he was
I found out reading your
born
book.
Asa Yoelson, yes, in Russia. So the famous basically analysis of this, and this is Michael Rogan, is the idea that by using black makeup, Jews whiten themselves, because unless you're white, you don't need black makeup. And this also worked to a certain extent in the Israeli production. So on the one hand, you try to draw close to the Black Africans, but then of course the makeup always reminds us that there's a distance. The interesting thing here really is that whereas the mainstream interpretation was that this production, again, signaled how Israel is supporting the anti-apartheid cause, there were other critics and reviewers who were able to read it very differently. And they said, well, this isn't really about critically. Mm-hmm. This isn't really about apartheid in South Africa, about oppression there. This could also be seen as a statement about oppression here in Israel. Mm-hmm. And someone like Azriel Karlibach, who was the editor of the very successful liberal daily Ma'ariv, wrote an essay, this is December 1953, called Cry the Beloved Country, in which basically he compares what the Israeli state did to the Arab citizens of Israel.
To the Arab citizens.
To the Arab citizens of Israel.
Not the Mizrahi Jews.
No, not the Mizrahi Jews.
That's a different story.
Well,
it could be looked this way.
Other
too.
critics also said, right, we think there's racial segregation in South Africa. There's also racial segregation in this country, in Israel. Here, Mizrahi Jews, North African Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews live separately. There is prejudice and so forth. Karlibach spoke specifically about the Israeli Arabs. And again, when we think about
Which
this,
is quite striking for the time it was written.
It's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Again, today, if an editor of an Israeli sort of newspaper would make this analogy between Israel and South Africa, all hell would break loose. Yeah. But then, somehow, he got away with it. And it's interesting because as other sort of critics have pointed out, something about the early 1950s was really fascinating. People could say things before the code of silencing and repression was somehow exercised.
What do you mean by that? That's really interesting.
I mean that if, for example, and this is not the topic of my book.
No,
if,
no,
for
but
example,
it's, yeah.
if you, for example, read the Israeli newspapers' reports during the 1948-1949 War for Independence, you'll see that there are items about looting, about sometimes, I think, right, even rape are mentioned, right? Things that later were simply sort of concealed and repressed were there. It was all there. And why were they there? Because it was impossible to ignore, because people, they lived through this.
Yeah.
And I think this is also similar to what we find in terms of the of Kalibach's allusion to the apartheid. This was still too new, too raw to be simply ignored or shoved aside. And it's fascinating. Again, this was not the mainstream interpretation, I think, of the production, but the fact that Kalibach, who was the most eminent journalist,
very
could say this says something.
Says a lot, yeah. And then, I mean, why did you decide to focus on these more or less 2 decades in the beginning of the first 2 decades of the state? Is it because things, like you said, changed after the Six-Day War in 1967, and the entire way that Israelis perceived the relationship with Africa changed?
Well, the reason I focused on these decades was the fact that, as I've said, they've been sort of forgotten, and it seemed just very important to try and basically remind Israelis what happened there. But also, as I've said, in those 2 decades, the encounter was so extensive, so much happened. As I've said, the number of Israelis who went there, the number of initiatives. Again, there was, of course, the bleaker, darker military assistance, but also, the Mifal HaPais, the lottery experts went to Africa to teach the Africans how to create their own lotteries. So this worked on, and if you look at the musical, the literary, the theatrical sort of output of these encounters, it's a huge archive just waiting to be discovered.
Yeah.
Even down to a story of the Tel Aviv Zoo and how they wanted to send a few lion cubs to Ghana and the complications that this. The story is so rich that it just seemed like the best thing to do in terms of the research. But I have to say that the conclusion does jump ahead to Israel today and to the different ways in which Africa has really shaped the cultural and physical environment of life here today. So if in the 1960s and 70s this was still somehow something distant, Israelis went there, but it wasn't such a crucial part of everyday life. What happens from the 1990s onwards are 3 parallel processes. One is the immigration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the 1980s and 90s. The second is the growing sort of covenant between Israel and South Africa and the way that it's perceived. And finally, the growing presence of African work migrants and now refugees in
and
the
also
Israeli,
I would add, I don't know,
street.
just as a suggestion, the evolution of the discourse, because you cannot imagine seeing blackface on an Israeli theater stage today. It's so politically incorrect.
It's true that it has disappeared. I'm not sure it's seen. Someone just actually mentioned to me, which is true, by the way, that when in Eretz Nehederet, the leading satirical program in Israel, when they actually when the actors play, let's say Barack Obama or even Ethiopian Jews, of course they use blackface.
Yeah.
Right. Again, blackface.
But they use makeup for other white characters
that's true.
as well.
So I don't want to sound, I don't think that every use of blackface is wrong. Very often, you need, if you want to create a mimetic sort of illusion on stage, you need the makeup. So I don't think necessarily it's bad. I think what happened in the 1950s is the way that it really complicated the direct sort of identification with Africans. So today, yes, of course, norms have changed. There is much more, I think, awareness now of Israel's sort of relationship to colonial ideas, tropes, and practices. But I think that what we see now, what we saw a few weeks ago in Tel Aviv, that we saw, I think, tens of thousands of African refugees just filling the streets in this silent demonstration was really, I think, the most glowing sort of image that reminded us that Africa is not simply just out there, it's here. We are part of this African sort of space, and we can no longer repress this.
All right, and on this note, which is kind of hopeful, I'm assuming, we'll have to end. Dr. Eitan Bar-Yosef, a literary scholar and cultural historian at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and author of the recently published A Villa in the Jungle, Africa in Israeli Culture. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
That was the Tel Aviv Review for today. Thank you very much for listening. Many thanks to our guests, Orna Sasson-Levy, David N. Myers, and Eitan Bar-Yosef. Also, a big thank you to Tammy Goldenberg, the technical producer of this show. I am Gilad Halpern. Don't hesitate to email me on Gilad, Gilad, at tlv1.fm, and also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. That's it for this week. Join us again next week for the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, goodbye.